Looking Beyond the Words, a contextual analysis of the Revolt of Mother by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. About the author, Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Freeman was born in a small town in Massachusetts on October 31st, 1852. She grew up in a very strict Christian household that held many strict standards, which later on influenced her writing. Freeman grew up very poor, but her dedication to writing and in captivating stories, which she began to sell to companies such as Harper's Bazaar in her 20s after the death of both of her parents, helped relieve her from the life of poverty she grew up in. Freeman's work became very popular due to the relevance they had to many women in society, and she became one of the first women to be presented with a W.D. Howells Medal for Fiction, as well as being elected to the National Institute of Arts and Letters. And part of the reason why her works were so popular is because she talked a lot about the rights that women had stripped of them due to these very Christian Puritan traditions that the society she was living in held on women. And a lot of women obviously were able to relate to that. So a big part of her success is her relatability to the woman during her time and her breakthrough in the natural conventions of their society. So a summary of the Revolt of Mother. So the Revolt of Mother is about a family in the small town who lives on a farm. The main character is Sarah Penn. She is the mother that the title refers to. It is her husband, Mr. Penn, and their two children. So Sarah Penn found out that her husband was building a barn instead of a house, which enraged her because 40 years ago, when her and Mr. Penn had gotten married, he told her that that exact spot was going to be where he built the house for her that she deserved, that he wasn't going to have her living, in the small shack-like house that they had currently been in. However, she sees now that he is building this barn atop of where he had promised her those 40 years ago that he would build their house for them. So she's upset about that. And Mr. Penn is very apathetic toward Mrs. Penn's wishes and continues with the building of the barn in preparation for the new livestock he will be receiving. This further enraged Mrs. Penn because her husband, Mr. Penn, had not come in and talked to her about any of this, which was very common for this time. Men were the heads of the households. The women were just meant to, cook, clean, do those traditional women and motherly duties. So he had not informed his wife of his plans to build the barn or get more livestock. And her husband's lack of empathy and unwillingness to keep his promise to her caused Miss Penn to become even more frustrated, not only with the situation at hand, but also with her husband. Mr. Penn, later on in the story, goes on a trip the weekend the barn has been fully built, and all that is left to do is add the hay and the livestock, which he is going on this trip to get the perfect horse for himself. Mrs. Penn's family member actually had reached out and said that he had found a horse that he thinks that he would love, so Mr. Penn jumped on the opportunity. Mrs. Penn, however, decided that now is her moment and tells her children to grab all of their belongings and move them into the new house, blatantly disregarding her husband's wishes. So she decided to take advantage of the fact that her husband was gone for the weekend. He was going to be gone for 4 days, and move her children into this newly built barn. So Miss Penn makes the barn a better version of their original home, and upon Mr. Penn's return, does not argue with him, but rather demands a few things to be done to make it a more inviting space, such as adding windows and other partitions, because it is a barn. It was actually built for livestock. But in the end, Mr. Penn gives in without a fight and agrees to do the tasks that Mrs. Penn has asked of him to better their new home within the barn. And that is how the story ends. Mrs. Penn stood her ground. She did not back down from her husband, and she was able to get that house in the spot that she had been promised 40 years prior by her husband. So the main theme of The Revolt of Mother by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman is the divergence of women from their traditional gender roles that are brought upon them by society. So throughout the story, Sarah Penn, the main character, became less and less of the traditional women that we, the audience, would expect from characters of this time period. Although she did still keep up with the housework, the cooking, the cleaning, as there's nobody else to do it. She directly defies her husband's wishes of use for the new building to be used as a barn and takes it upon herself as the woman of the household to turn it into their new home while he is gone for the weekend. And a big part of, this playing into the theme is that in this period of history, this would be deemed entirely unacceptable. And Freeman's writings collectively work to show the emergence of women from the passive and submissive roles that society has set for them. And Sarah Penn in this story, The Revolt of Mother, is a great example of that. So some of the contextual evidence that was found in the story, first off, is realism. So literary realism is the observation and documentation of the details of everyday life, and it is utilized in The Revolt of Mother by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman to depict the interactions not only her character Sarah Penn faced, but those felt by women around the country. So these interactions are the interactions that women are having with men completely disregarding their wants and needs. And Sarah Penn does take it upon herself to break those traditional character roles. So some examples of realism that were found in The Revolt of Mother was when Sarah Penn stated, "One of these days you'll find out, and then you'll know that we only know what men folks think we do." And this is in reference to Sarah Penn talking to her daughter Nanny, who is about to be married, and basically telling her that there is no point in arguing with men because even though we may know more than they think that we do, at the end of the day, they still believe us to be inferior in pretty much all aspects. So there's no point in arguing with them, which was, a very big thing seen in households throughout this time period. And then another statement that Sarah Penn made was, "He can't help it because he don't look at things just the way we do," which she said in regards to talking again to her daughter Nanny about her husband and Nanny's father, which is that his lack of apathy and lack of understanding as to why, Sarah Penn mainly, but also her daughter mentions it as well, wants that barn to be their house. And just stating that men, which is kind of like, it's a very broad statement that Freeman is applying to men across this time period. They don't understand why, these women want the things that they do. And women have a different light of looking at things. However, because of the society that they lived in, they weren't able to get that across. So next we have power struggles between men and women. So during the time which this story was written and published, even something as ordinary as a bicycle could become a symbol of female emancipation due to the fact that during the turn of the 19th century, women were more exposed to things they were traditionally kept from. However, they were still expected to stick to the traditional housekeeping roles given to them by society. So Freeman plays on the struggle for women through the presentation of her character Sarah Penn in The Revolt of Mother, who begins to break free of these traditional rules, regardless of the possible consequences she is to face from her husband and other men in the community. So some examples from this story are when the narrator, this is written in third person, says, "Sarah Penn stood in the door like a queen. She held her head as if it bore a crown." This is in reference to Sarah wanting to confront her husband officially about the barn that's being built. So typically women during this time period would not be confronting their husbands about anything because the amount of reprimandment that could be handed back to them was significant, and it was very common. So this is really significant to the story because it is showing how Sarah Penn is breaking these traditional standards, and beckoning her husband, showing him that she is a large part of this household and she is not going to stand down when she has a problem with something. And then the next statement is again by the narrator, saying she made up her mind to her course of action. So this is referring to the main character, Sarah Penn. And this is in reference to her husband's leaving to go get the horse from her family member for the weekend. So this is when Sarah decides that she will not be abiding by what her husband wants, that barn will not actually be a barn, and she is going to fulfill the promise to herself that her husband made, of that area being her house, that, she's going to move all of her belongings, her children, into that barn and make it their home, because that is what she's promised. She has the opportunity, and as we see, she is not one to back down. So that is what that quote is in reference to. Next, we have the environment. So Freeman gives us some of the largest context into the era with which she is trying to describe through the use of sharing the state of the environment, which could be through economic, societal, or physical landscape. So the people described in the Revolt of Mother, including both main family and the townspeople around them, were part of the working farmer class who seem to have evaded the large-scale farming takeover that happened at the turn of the 19th century. They describe in some points of the story, as I'm pointing out in these quotations here, the Penn family does have their own farm. They have a barn. They actually have multiple barns and other stalls for livestock. And it is even mentioned that they are one of the wealthiest families in the town. So some of the examples in the text of the environment are when Mrs. Penn is confronting her husband and states, "Be you going to buy more cows?" Again, this was when she was confronting her husband about the fact that he was building the barn, asking him why he was doing it, and bringing up the fact that she now knows that it's more than just building the barn. He was planning, or has already bought more cows, more livestock, when in reality she is the one that's having to tend to them, and they already have a couple of their own. Next is when Mr. Penn states, "If I come up country right off, there's a chance to buy just the kind of horse I want." So this is in reference to him breaking the news to Mrs. Penn that he will be leaving for the 4 days for the weekend, to go get the horse that he had gotten a letter in the mail about. And then next is kind of more of like personal life, and this was in reference to Mrs. Penn when she got his shaving water and razor ready, because Mr. Penn was going to go do a formal transaction. So she got his supplies ready for him, which in today's society, many of us wouldn't necessarily say shaving water and razor. A lot of us just, do it in the shower. So I feel like this really speaks to the time that they were in. Also, the fact that to do this interaction, you had to go look your best, even if you were just going to buy it from a family member. And then overall, by looking into and gaining a further understanding of the contextual elements used by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman in her story, The Revolt of Mother, the audience can sympathize better with the main character, Sarah Penn. This comes from the contextual elements showing how politically and fundamentally different this time in history was from what it is like today. In today's society, women are able to speak up for themselves, complain if they feel the need to, and are not forced by society to stay home and do the housework without any help from the men around them. However, during the period the story was written, That is exactly what women were forced to do. Researching this contextual elements of this piece of literature also helps the audience to better grasp the theme, which is that of women fighting off traditional gender roles that have been institutionalized into their society. By knowing this and the importance of the contextual evidence, the reader can now better understand the importance of the character Sarah Penn and her defiance of her husband's wishes. And then here is the works cited. Thank you.